Like at home, because $100. Yeah, and then right after like we're leaving in the crowd, like we're like, yeah. Or take the route like 8 hours. I put it in a couple of minutes, and I'm like, I swear it's not what we're doing. Going down for that. That's right. Oh, yeah. I think we go
All right, good morning, welcome back. Let's get started for the day. So my graduate dissertation has finally been bound and published after 2.5 years since graduating. So I'm very excited to have this in my office. Let's go ahead and get rolling on today's practice question. Goes over some things that we talked about last class. So when you read "Let's Ice," Jeremy, what you know is that the speaker is talking about going ice skating with Jeremy, rather than putting him in the freezer because he's not a serial killer. The use of a comma in the sentence, right? "Let's ice, Jeremy," to help understand this sentence uses which rule of language? So think about how the comma helps us to understand the purpose of this sentence, either as a pragmatic, syntactic, semantic, or contextual rule. Take a couple minutes to think about this question. We'll talk about it together. The slips I'm handing out to you will be relevant later in class. Give it a look. And I like to do this, and I was like, you can turn these over if you want to, but I will not be for going. I'm going to and that's like and then another way like the rest of us all as people that we have Anybody who did not get a slip of paper? Okay. Anybody who'd like more time on this question? All right, let's talk about it. So different rules of communication. How many people think this is A, pragmatic? B, syntactic, C, semantic, or D, contextual? Yes, so the answer here is syntactic. So we talked last class about how language has different rules, and we use verbal communication through a process of sharing meaning. That when we go from a sender to a receiver, the idea is that you are understanding what it is that they say based on these different rules, right? So eats, comma, shoots, and leaves is a very different sentence than eats, shoots, and leaves because it specifies eating plants versus walking into a bar and shooting a gun. So the rules of language here are syntactic because the use of punctuation and phrasing really helps you. Another example, of course, being let's eat grandma versus let's eat, comma, grandma. Meanwhile, semantic, again, is the dictionary definition. The important thing to know here about semantic is that the dictionary definition that you choose is going to be different depending on the tone, the way that it's said, and depending on context. For instance, let's take the word bow, right? Meaning something like a bow and arrow or tying a bow or ribbon versus bow, which would mean, lowering your body as a sign of respect. So semantic would be using the different tones and pronunciations of those words to understand verbal communication. And then pragmatic is about thinking of the situation, what you know about the person, and what makes a whole lot of sense. If somebody is talking about drafting and you know that they really like art, there's a good chance that they have not been drafted to the military. They instead are going to drafting school. All right. So we talked about language and verbal communication. Any questions about anything on verbal communication or anything we talked about last class? Great. So today we are shifting gears to talk about nonverbal communication. We'll be looking at why nonverbal communication is important, and then we'll also be identifying the different types and different functions of nonverbal communication. It's important for us to know the difference between a type or variety of nonverbal communication versus a function or a way that nonverbal communication is used. So we'll be going over the differences between those things in just a little bit. However, we are 2 weeks out from the start of the midterm window. So as promised, I have a midterm study guide that's available for you to access. I also have practice questions for the midterm exam. So I wanted to go over both of those so that you get a sense of what resources are available for you to help you study and prepare. Go to the front page of Canvas and you'll notice that there is a midterm study guide that is posted right here. So the midterm study guide goes over all of the different terms and concepts that I'm asking you to know as you go into the midterm exam. Remember that this midterm is open note and open book. So one thing that might be really helpful as you're gearing up for and preparing for the exam is to just create your own version of this document, download the version for yourself or paste it onto Google Docs and start to punch in what you see as the answers to these definitions or questions, right? So one way of thinking about preparing for the exam that I think works really well is to look at each term or concept that's brought up in the class and answer 2 questions. First of all, can I define this term in my own words? Second of all, can I give an example of this term in action? For instance, right, maybe we are looking at temperament. So, right, temperament is generally more biologically determined, and it refers to aspects that define how it is that we behave. For example, if somebody has a more aggressive temperament, they're more likely to be verbally combative and interrupt people in sentences. So you have a definition, you have an example. These terms are pretty chronological, right? They've moved through us as we've gone through the weeks. Starting with some of the basics of interpersonal communication, the 6-part model we talked about, perception, moving on into elements of intrapersonal communication and identity that we got into last week, and then moving into verbal and nonverbal communication that we're getting into for this week. And then next week, we'll be getting into culture, right? The elements of culture, identity, cultural context. So some of these terms that are toward the end are things that we'll be getting into for the next week. And in addition to knowing these terms and concepts, you're responsible for knowing these first 4 readings, right? And having some notes for yourself. I'm not going to ask you to know specific examples from those readings. The expectation going in is that you have read through those readings and you feel comfortable knowing that the exam is connected to those things. So that's what I'm looking for there. And that study guide, again, goes through all the things that you need. What I will do on the midterm review day is give you the chance, if there are any terms or concepts that you're a little bit unsure of or confused about, for us to go over those in a little bit more detail. So that's the study guide. The other thing that is available for you to help you to prepare are a series of practice questions. So we've been doing these practice questions all the time in the class. But in addition to those, I want to give you the chance to do some additional questions. Also, to do some example short essay questions. So you'll notice, right, that there are 5 different multiple choice questions that you can work through. You do not have to take the practice exam, practice questions. You can take it as many times as you want, and it does show the correct answers to these questions. I will tell you that sometimes I will directly take questions from the practice and put it on the regular exam. So it probably behooves you to work through the practice questions. What I have here are 2 examples of short essay questions, right? So what the exam does is it gives you 4 prompts for short essay questions, and will ask you to complete 3 out of the 4. We will be doing an in-class example for your attendance credit on Friday, where you'll be working through a practice short essay question. I have these 2 here. You don't need to do them if you don't want to, but one thing that I always offer to people is that if you choose to take these practice questions and complete them or email them to me, I will give you feedback on them and I would let you know where you would score. So you don't have to do them, but you're welcome to do them if you would like some additional practice and preparation. So I recommend study guide, practice questions. Remember that the exam is open note and open book. You take it wherever you want rather than in class. And you've got that 3-day window, but with 2 hours to take it once you choose to open it. We also, the first class in week 5. So we have this week on verbal and nonverbal. We have the next week on culture, right? On Monday, October 24th, that day is just dedicated toward midterm review. So come on that day with your questions, but I'm also available through email to help with questions and other material. And I also recommend, using the recording and slides from previous classes if you know that there are concepts and ideas that you need to do this. Any questions on any of that? Again, I know that midterms can be scary and kind of weird beasts, and we're coming to the point where you're like, whoa, got a midterm coming. I like to make it as low stress as possible, right? I'm not looking for the kind of regurgitating short-term memory thing where you cram for something and then forget about it, right? This is more about the overall work that you're putting in terms of studying, working through understanding the material, and essentially showing off what you've learned. So you should not be coming into this super high stress about it, but if you need additional support, I'm happy to help. So let's talk about nonverbal communication. What is nonverbal communication? So if we define verbal communication as the use of language, the use of spoken or written symbols to communicate, how would we define nonverbal communication? Yeah. So one easy answer, right, building off of that, is everything else. So nonverbal communication is when we use things other than words, right? So if we use things other than words that are spoken and written, right, we are conveying information to people in a variety of different ways. So for instance, we might be using eye contact, right? In a lot of cultures, using eye contact is a sign of showing that you're listening and that you're following along to a message. However, in some cultures, right, prolonged eye contact is seen as a sign of disrespect. So how eye contact is used is one major difference. Body language or physicality, right, building off of that point, the way that we physically present ourselves is a big element here. Also vocal cues. So while the things that you say, right, the direct language choices that you make are verbal communication, what's considered to be nonverbal communication is how you say those verbal things. Think back to my last sentence, right? How you say those things is nonverbal communication. I emphasize the word how really loudly in order to hit on that key point. So using pauses, changes in your vocal delivery and style, those elements would fit under nonverbal communication, right? So we cannot not communicate. In fact, right, the very idea of us being physically present in a space is itself nonverbal communication. We are walking down a hallway, people are passing by us, right? We're on Zoom and maybe we have our video off, right? That's communicating a nonverbal message. So how we communicate nonverbally is something that we're always doing, right? All the world's a stage. We're always engaged in some type of performance and expression to other people, whether we like it or not. So nonverbal communication, right, covers a lot of different elements of meaning. In fact, again, a lot of studies suggest that nonverbal communication can be up to 93% of meaning. And in fact, we oftentimes attribute more trust to our nonverbal communication. If somebody says, "It's great to see you," and they're rolling their eyes, we're more likely to trust that they are not happy to see us and they're being sarcastic, right? Nonverbal communication can be misinterpreted. So for instance, Tourette's, right, and something like a vocal tic would be an example of somebody that is conveying a message that's maybe not understood by other people in the way that they intend. They didn't mean to say that, but that's not how they really feel, right? If somebody's yelling, "I hate you," that doesn't mean that they hate you, right? It just means that that's part of the tic. Nonverbal communication is always there, it's omnipresent, right? So long as we're human beings, we are communicating nonverbally. Nonverbal communication provides context, right? It gives us the information that lets us make decisions. So if we think back, right, the challenges that we've felt with communicating over Zoom, the exhaustion that we've often felt in Zoom meetings that's disproportionate to face-to-face is because our brains work in overdrive to try to figure out and identify context. We have this little flat box or a lot of different boxes. We're trying to parse out detailed information from just what little we have there. It's used for relationships, right? Anybody that's used Snapchat knows that nonverbal communication can support the development of relationships. Picture says 1,000 words, right? It also involves the use of universal language. I think that the Disney Pixar film Inside Out is really clever. How many people have seen this one? So several of you, right? If you haven't seen it, the premise is that the characters are emotions inside people's heads, right? And what I find that's really, really interesting, if we even just look at the poster, right? We know what emotions they stand in for and represent just on the way that they physically and non-verbally present themselves, right? Anger has this like eyebrows furrowed, he seems frustrated, fear has his eyes bugged out, right? We recognize emotions due to nonverbal communication, due to the coloration, right? We associate red with anger, right? The way that visual presentation informs how we understand the emotions and experiences of other people is a big part of emotional intelligence and how we come to develop our relationships. Just wanted to share a short clip from this film that highlights the ways that nonverbal communication helps us to understand these relationships.
How was the first day of school?
Fine, I guess. I don't know.
Do you ever look at someone and wonder, what is going on inside their head? You're going to keep that on that. Sure, something's wrong. We're going to find out what's happening, but we'll need support. Signal the husband.
Uh-oh, she's looking at this. What did she say? Well, sorry, sir, no was listening. We left the toilet seat up. What? What is it, woman? What?
Signal them again.
Right, so it's kind of fun because the parents are using things like, gesturing with the eyes. You see that the emotions in the head, right, are expressing themselves. One is very jumpy, one is angry and frustrated. I just find this is an interesting way to think about nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication is something that we can divide into different categories. I encourage you to think about these categories because they're going to be relevant in just a little bit to that slip of paper that I handed out to you. And I'd like to talk a little bit about each of these: haptics, vocalics, kinesics. oculesics, and physical appearance, because they're things that we do all the time, but I think examining the ways that they impact our communication is really useful. So let's talk first about haptics, right? So haptics involve the use of touch. Haptics is, of course, something that we want to be very careful about because, especially in the context of COVID-19 and what we could consider to be appropriate use of touch, right? There are a lot of concerns about consent and bodily autonomy that we have to consider in the use of haptics. But in a lot of situations, especially with people that we are close with, we are comfortable with, and that we feel comfortable with touch, using touch with, right? That can be an important way that we can communicate. In fact, a lot of studies have suggested that one of the things that contributed to depression and negative feelings under COVID-19 was the touch deprivation that a lot of people had. That while we use touch to maintain our relationships, even if it's putting your arm over the shoulder of a friend, right? Or giving somebody a high five, that those little moments, even if they're platonic, can actually help us to feel more fulfilled relationships. And human beings are seeking touch or comfort. So for instance, somebody who is going around with a little sign that says free hugs, right, would be an example of the use of haptics. So haptics would be measured through duration, frequency, and intensity, right? Duration would be how long is touch being used. So I'll give you one example, right, is if you have a friend who gives you a hug and you aren't necessarily comfortable with hugs, there's a good chance that you're more likely to tap that person on the back. It's something that is more commonly used if you're feeling discomfort with that interaction, but you're more likely to hold your hand there if you're hugging somebody and you're really comfortable with that person, like a close family member. So that's an interesting way that we kind of instinctually respond to duration. Frequency is how often touch happens, right? So do you regularly shake somebody's hand? Do you socially distance and avoid touch entirely? And how intense is it? Again, is it a long hug? Is it, a passionate kiss with somebody? The length of and intensity of haptics really shape our communication in different ways. One thing that I think is useful to understand here is the role of culture, right? And how different cultures use haptics might impact what meaning looks like for that culture. So in a lot of European countries, including countries in Western Europe, people are more likely as platonic friends to hold hands or to put their arms over each other, right? And that's just the cultural norm that is symbolizing platonic friendships. In the United States, it's more common to interpret putting your arm over somebody or holding somebody's hand as a romantic gesture, that you and that person are involved, right? So how we might interpret that is going to look a little bit different. Also, right, we might think about gender and gender stereotypes that impact haptics as well. For instance, oftentimes the use of cuddling or snuggling in platonic relationships among women is more likely to be seen as platonic than romantic, right? So there are some kind of differences in how we might understand and interpret the use of haptics. We also have the use of vocalics. So again, what you say is verbal, how you say it, including your tone of voice and expressions, is nonverbal. So if you're involved in choir or you sing, right? Are you a tenor? Are you a soprano? Are you an alto? Right? The way that your vocal range and singing style is classified would fit under the definition of vocals. Timbre and pitch refer to the vocal range and quality of your voice. So for instance, there are some people, including a couple people at EOU, who have these like amazing radio voices. They're like very smooth, easy to listen to, engaging, very soothing and calming, right? So chances are that if you're listening to a podcast or watching a video essay, that there's somebody whose voice and style really resonates with you due to their timbre and pitch. There's also tempo. How quickly does somebody speak? So your tempo is likely to be informed by culture, your knowledge of the language, how excited you are, your emotional state with that person, and a lot of other cultural cues. So I'll give you an example, right? I was involved in debate in which our rate of delivery was very, very quick, right? Our tempo was very fast. So when we were in debate, we would speak like observation weather resolution analysis, subway native resolution, United States federal government states will increase its support for high-speed rail in the United States, right? We did that. for like 7 or 8 minutes. So it's a lot of fun. And also the use of disfluencies like verbal fillers fits under vocalics too. So using separating out your sentences because we want to fill in physical space would be an example of vocalics. A lot of people use more verbal fillers than they think. Uses like you might go back and see a recording of yourself and realize you use a lot more verbal fillers than you want. In fact, recording yourself is a great way to practice if you're in class like public speaking and want to learn how to speak better. I had a debate coach who would throw a wadded up piece of paper at me every time I used a verbal filler and help me get a little bit better at that. So got a blobfish over here, right? One of the silliest looking fish I've ever seen. It is very emotive, probably without intending to be. So we look at this fish and we think, oh, it looks so sad. It's got a little frown. We're kind of interpreting this fish's physicality to the human emotion, but this fish is probably okay, or it's probably doing fine. If it's still alive, it's out of the water, so I'm not sure, right? But when we tend to anthropomorphize and attribute human emotions to things, we're using those cues that we have to help to inform what it is that we're interpreting. So kinesics refers to the way that we use things like gestures, the way that we use things like facial expressions, and the ways that we use our body behavior to communicate. So for instance, you notice that I like to wander around class. That's to help connect people who are at different sides of the room. So that'd be an example of using kinesics. Another thing that if you're presenting or you're in a public speaking class that I recommend, it's called the box. The box kind of covers the area around your upper chest. And that's generally the best place to gesture because it makes your gestures deliberate. You're not doing the little like wiggly arms and you're not like, I don't know, playing basketball, right? So gestures in that way can be used as well to be effective. Again, classes like public speaking get into that in a bit more detail. But how we convey and emphasize things is really closely tied to that. In fact, we use a lot more kinesics the more we feel comfortable with other people. In fact, according to uncertainty reduction theory, the more openness and connection that we have with people, the more likely we are to express ourselves non-verbally and open up. You're meeting somebody for the first time, you're very guarded. How are you? Oh, I'm okay. How are you? And so the amount of information that's conveyed non-verbally increases over time. So I also chose this image because SADFISH is an acronym that we can use to understand elements of kinesics and how we choose to communicate, right? So conveying surprise, anger, disgust, fear, interest, sadness, and happiness, how we show those with our body, with our facial expressions, with our reactions, that's using kinesics. We also have different types of gestures that we can utilize to help us to engage. So one of them is the use of an emblem, right? So an emblem would be standing in for or symbolizing communication non-verbally. So for instance, the peace sign, right, would be an example that was commonly used in the context of the Vietnam War, right? Might also be symbolizing victory. If you've played like a Super Mario game, like Super Mario 64, right? Mario always likes to give that sign when he's gotten a star. That'd be an example, right, of using an emblem to communicate that he has successfully gotten through the level and that he looks really weird in the new movie. So we also have affect displays. So affect displays would be just showing your affect or your immediate visceral reaction to something. So if somebody is telling you the T, then your reaction and shock might be affect displays. We also use regulators. So regulators might be things like nodding to indicate that you would like to manage that conversation by continuing. So you're interested and you want to learn more. You might, for instance, start to look at or point to the clock. That would be a regulator that's saying, hey, we're almost out of time, right? Or if you're starting to zip up your backpack at the end of class, I know that we're about out of time too. So that would be an example of using regulators to assist with nonverbal communication. So we've had a lot of discussion about social distancing and proximity over the years. There is a good chance that charts and visuals like this one are ones that we have had to become intimately familiar with and understand a lot better. But I do think that it's a way that we have gained a lot more focus and attention on different elements of proxemics in a way that we probably hadn't before. So I think that this looks a little bit different now, especially when we think about how physical distancing might be used to convey meaning. But we have what are considered to be different spaces or spheres. So in a very intimate space, in this 0 to 18 inches, that's with somebody you're very close with, right? You're talking very closely to that person. Maybe it's a close friend or somebody that you're romantic with, right? You're using communication in this very, very close space. Some people like to say, don't step into my bubble, right? Or don't get into my bubble. If somebody is in your bubble and you're comfortable with them there, that would be in the intimate space. The personal space, so say you're at a party, right? And you're talking to somebody at that party. That's probably the personal space where somebody that you're a bit more casual with and you're having a conversation with that person. So one thing that you have heard, I am sure to death, is this idea of social distancing, right? Social distancing is 6 feet, right? So social distancing fits under this yellow sphere under the 6 feet in the 4 to 12 feet range. We generally use the social sphere if, for instance, you're in a social circle with people, right? Or if you smoke and you're in a smoker circle, there's a good chance that you are in that social space as well. And then the public space is beyond that, right? So folks that are in some of the further rows in the class are in the public space. So how physically close we are to a person is an important element of how we communicate. We can be closer to a person to indicate our comfort and that we want to better understand and connect to that person. We might pull back, right, and use physical distancing as a way of conveying that social distance as well. So for instance, maybe somebody has told you a secret or a story that makes you no longer trust them. Like, I cheated on you, right? You start to physically walk away from them. You have this instinctual reaction to get out of a personal space with them. So our use of proximity is important and matters in how we choose to communicate with other people. I mentioned a little bit about oculesics. This is the use of eye contact and eyes to communicate. Again, across culture and across identity, how we use eye contact could look a little bit different. In some cultures, eye contact is seen as important and sustained. In other cultures, right, eye contact is seen as something that might be a sign of disrespect that's happening for too long. There are also a lot of folks, for instance, in neurodivergent communities who have talked about how the use of sustained eye contact can be uncomfortable and can be a source of sensory overstimulation. So if I don't do sustained eye contact for you, it's nothing personal. So oculesics is an important element for us to consider, but also this idea of facial expressions and conveying internal dialogue. Again, an important element of effective nonverbal communication is engaging with emotional intelligence, understanding how somebody else is feeling. If they're sad, if they're upset, if they're bored, right? You're responding to that communication and adjusting how you choose to communicate with that in mind. We also have to consider physical appearance. You're always communicating. And so regardless of whether or not we intend for our physical appearance to have an impact on our communication, it does, right? And it oftentimes does in very uneven ways. For instance, if you ever follow things like the red carpets before things like Academy Award shows or other events like the Grammys, there's a good chance that there is a lot of media attention dedicated to the outfits and clothing choices that people make, right? A lot of you probably remember years ago when Lady Gaga wore a dress made out of meat. That was a symbol, that was a statement, right? That was stuck with us. So physical appearance shows us who we are. Many of you are wearing sweatshirts or outfits that might be affiliated with an athletic group on campus, right? I see Eastern football up here in the front, right? That's communicating. And how we come across to other people. So what is the version of ourselves that we want to show to other people? That's a way that we use physical appearance. Norms about what physical appearance looks like, what's considered to be an ideal physical appearance or body type, right? Those things vary a lot. In fact, in many cultures, having a larger body is seen as a sign of prosperity and good health. So we also know the very gendered impacts of body image, how projections of the body are portrayed through media, what is the ideal quote unquote body type. Those are things that connect to our conceptions of physical appearance. So any questions about any of those types of nonverbal communication before we move on? Okay, so let's talk about functions. So each of you has a slip of paper that has a function on it. And I'm going to ask you to continue to hold on to that and think about that, because in a little bit, I'm going to ask each of you to express nonverbal communication using your assigned function. So these 6 different functions of nonverbal communication are ways that we use nonverbal communication to do different things. If types are telling us these are elements and ways that we do nonverbal communication, functions are saying this is what our nonverbal communication is achieving, right? This is our goal. So complementing is when you provide a nonverbal message that's able to support what you're saying verbally, right? So it's not saying the exact thing, but it is providing information that augments and otherwise helps that main message. So for instance, saying, we've got this, right? Giving a thumbs up with that sentence is supporting and complementing what it is that you're saying. So if you say, for instance, that something complements something else, supporting it, adding to it, right? Contradicting, right? So if Tony Stark is rolling his eyes at the current state of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, how bad some of the shows and movies are, right? That would be contradicting if you were to say that, oh yeah, things are great, right? So contradicting is when there is a mismatch between what you're saying verbally and what you're communicating non-verbally. One really good example of this would be doing this. Oh yeah, I'm listening, right? Because there's a contradiction between you saying that you're listening and you paying attention on your phone. So it's going against the original message, either intentionally or unintentionally. Saying, this sounds great, and rolling your eyes would be an example of how we use contradiction. And again, knowing what we know about how nonverbal communication works, we tend to give it more trust. So if somebody is rolling their eyes and saying, great to see you, we're more likely to not believe them, right? And interpret the nonverbal message. Talk is cheap, right? Oftentimes we tend to associate nonverbal communication as somehow showing us the true side to the person or the thing that goes against what it is that they're saying. So repeating, right, is a little bit different than complimenting. Repeating involves directly confirming or doing nonverbal communication that is a one-for-one with the verbal communication that you're doing, right? So nodding and saying yes, right? Well, nodding says yes. Verbally saying yes, both of those things together are essentially communicating verbally and non-verbally the exact same message, right? So while complimenting can support, repeating is doing the exact thing over again. No would be another example. Substituting. So substituting would mean filling in for nonverbal communication. So in this case, we are using nonverbal communication instead of verbal communication. So maybe you are about to get out of practice and you just use peace sign, right? You peace out. That would be an example of how we use substitution. And then we have accenting, right? So as mentioned, we tend to point out specific parts of sentences and highlight those as a way of getting across a key point. We have got to try this, emphasizing the word got really highlights for that person the importance of getting that item. So accenting is how we highlight parts of a sentence. And then we also have the role of regulating, right? So regulating would be a way that you manage a communication relationship using nonverbal communication. right? So one example would be, hey, it's great to see you, tapping somebody on the shoulder, right? Another example of regulating would be pointing at the clock and saying, hey, we're almost out of time. So regulating is essentially establishing the boundaries for your communication relationship using nonverbal communication. Yes,
What was before writing?
accenting.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And remember, the slides are up in case you need to get back to them as well. So what I would like you to do now is you can either type this and email it to me, or you can get out a sheet of paper on your own with your name on it for attendance. What I want you to do is think about a sentence in which the function of communication that you've been given on a slip of paper could be used. So think about any sentence in which that function would matter. give you another minute to think about this. Then again, I'm going to ask you to share your sentence and nonverbal communication minutes. Anybody who would like some more time? Okay. So what I'd like us to do is to go through the class, share your sentence and the nonverbal communication that you have. And then after that, share which of the functions that you were assigned. Let's start here on this side.
So if I thought something was bad, and didn't want to verbally say something, I would just give someone a thumbs down. This conveys that I thought it was bad and it was not good.
So substituting, yes. So, right. There's a lot of gifts that would involve the use of substituting. Okay. Go for it. Yeah.
So I said, Jane walks up to Mary and says, I'm so glad you're able to come, but Jane rolls her eyes as she gives me a hug because she didn't want her to be there.
Be an example contradicting. Yeah.
Mine was accent thing, and I said, I will pick in when, like, how you usually know.
Yeah.
And the beginning.
Yeah. So ways to pump yourself up for a game, emphasizing win would be. Let's move on here to the second row. Yeah. Yeah.
So I got repeating, and I said like someone would ask me a question, I'll respond with, like yes.
Yeah.
Or like no.
Using both to communicate kind of double meaning. Yeah.
Mine was like leaning forward and.
Regulating. That's a great example, right? Leaning forward to better understand or listen to something.
For complimenting, we can do this.
Nice. Good choreography there. Right. All right. Let's move on here. Back here.
Yeah, one of my friends very much understanding that. And so,
And which one is that? Yeah. And see.
for regulating, I have like checking your watch when a plane is running out of time, like pointedly like. Running out of time.
Yeah, right. It's a very common practice for British folks in particular, right? Let's move on up here. Nick.
I got repeating, so I got my friends, and I in the hallway, and you can see me to come.
Yeah, yeah. So using that gesture to correspond. Excellent.
I said, like saying great job while giving a thumbs up shows that they did good.
Yeah. Someone else?
Someone's coming finally, and the person's calling, I had this piece of I got contradicting, I said, students said that answer my question on six. Another student rolled their eyes, knowing I was wrong.
Okay, no problem. We can come back.
I had regulating, maybe
Yeah, so initiating a conversation, waving something down, help the way you regulate.
Well, accenting. Example would be like, I say, I really don't know, emphasize really.
I really don't know. A lot of sentences play out very differently depending on what words in them you use.
So I had talked with you, right? Like if you're talking football, at the Denver Broncos, or was it?
So what would be that contradiction in that?
Sorry.
Right. So, right, how we would interpret it that based on your, what you were or are not a fan of would be there.
I got accent thing, so it's like, you have to watch this. And that's it.
Sure.
I had regulating, so if you're having a conversation, like pointing at the door, saying it's time to leave.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm substituting after. I read the class, I read the line instead of saying.
Yeah. Oftentimes, nonverbal communication makes things faster. I think.
I got repeating and I said like, for example, my friend asked me if I want to go get something to eat, but I already ate, so I shake my head down and said, like,
Conveys that extra meaning.
I like all the reasons and I put head time to you doing a good job. Thank you.
I'm still looking for you in somebody's house and just saying goodbye.
It's like how a lot of you are feeling, I'm sure.
I like how you I said I love school, but you have to like be in person because of the conversation. And I think that it could be conveyed in pretty much the way communication depending on the circumstance.
I'm regulating myself, not that working out of this kind of business.
Yeah, so I really like the examples that you all are using here. So oftentimes modifying our communication, we're making it easier, like waving goodbye, right? We're using nonverbal communication to give cues and hints like, hey, it's time to go, packing up, right? That information is stuff that we use all the time. So remember that when you're asked to identify those functions or those 6 different parts that we talked about. So to wrap up for today, we talked about nonverbal communication, why it matters, different types. We also talked about its importance for developing our relationships. So either email or pass forward your activity for today. We'll talk more about ways we can compare and understand these different elements of communication next class. You don't need the little slip. You can either toss it or hang on to it if you'd like. Have a great rest of your morning, and I will see you on Friday.
Have fun.